Welcome back for discussion number 21, where we'll be talking about Number the Stars and the historical fiction context that you read for today. During this video lecture, we're really going to discuss some of the historical context around Lowry's novel and how that impacts our reading of novels that are of this time period or written about this historical time period. So I'm really going to give you some context about Lowry's inspiration for the novel. You might want to take some brief notes, but don't go into too much detail when you're taking notes, as you can always refer back to this. So she wrote this novel in 1988, and she was inspired by her friend Anneliese Platt, who grew up in Denmark during World War II, when the country was occupied by Nazi Germany. And Lowry's novel is actually based on hours of conversations that she had with her friend and others who experienced the hardships of World War II. And she says that these conversations helped her realize for the first time that historic events and day-to-day life are not separate things. So Lowry says that in much of her writing, she tries to tell the big story by relating it to small details. And she uses this technique in Number the Stars. So she tells this larger story of life in Denmark during World War II through the everyday lives of the two girls. And so she says that her goal in writing is to focus on the vital need of humans to be aware of their interdependence or reliance on each other, and not only with each other, but the world and its environment at large. Now I want to go and talk about the historical context that's actually surrounding the novel. So this was written in 1988, but of course we're talking about the actual action of the novel is happening during the World War II. So it is set in mainly Copenhagen, Denmark, in 1943. And so in 1935, to give you some more context around this time period, in 1935, German Jews had lost their citizenship, and marriage between Jews and citizens of German blood was forbidden. In 1938, more than 1,000 synagogues were burned, thousands of Jewish businesses were looted, and 30,000 Jews were arrested. And then Jews began fleeing Germany, but many nations refused to take them as refugees. And as a result of Germany's expansion, soon not only German Jews, but Jews throughout Europe were at risk. It was in Eastern Europe that the Germans began the final and most horrific stage of their anti-Jewish campaign. So in early 1942, senior officials of the German government met to devise a final solution to the Jewish question, which may be both terms that you have heard before talking about World War II. In 1940, the country of Denmark, knowing it was too small to defend itself against the large Nazi forces, surrendered to Germany. And at the time when Number of the Stars was taking place, there were about 8,000 Jews living in Denmark, and most were descendants of Jews who had immigrated to Denmark hundreds of years earlier from Spain, Portugal, Germany, and Russia. And there was also about 1,500 Jewish refugees who had fled to Denmark in the early 1930s. To give you a bit more context surrounding Denmark itself at this time, in Denmark, laws protected Jews from anti-Semitism. In 1814, specifically, Danish parliament passed a bill making racial or religious discrimination a crime. And so when Germans first occupied Denmark in 1940, the former German ambassador to Denmark warned his superiors back in Berlin that it would be dangerous to limit the civil rights of Danish Jews in any way. And in 1943, when the Danish people heard that the Germans had decided to arrest their Jewish citizens, they banded together to form the Danish resistance. Members of this resistance helped nearly 7,000 people, almost the entire population of Danish Jews, cross the sea to freedom in Sweden. So now that I've given you a little bit of historical context, not only with the actual text and what's going on in the novel, but then also with Lowry and how she came about writing the novel, I wanted to give you a sampling of children's literature about World War II. So not only do you have this text to put away in your toolbox or toolkit of teaching that I like to refer to, but here's some other texts that you might think about. And if you were teaching this novel in class, thinking about you could pair these together, or have an assignment where students are looking at these other texts as an outside read or an independent read. So I just want you to go away with some different examples. So there's a couple of nonfiction texts, The Candy Bomber and Surviving Hitler, a couple of chapter books, Sky and The Devil's Arithmetic, and then there's a couple of picture books for you as well. The Number on My Grandfather's Arm, as well as The Yellow Star. The Yellow Star might be of particular interest to you because that is something that is specifically paired with Denmark and what was happening around Denmark at the time of World War II. So there's a lot of similarities that you can see that are drawn between Number of the Stars and The Yellow Star specifically. So that might be something that I would highly recommend that you check out.